Standing before reporters, President Donald Trump offered an upbeat, almost dismissive assessment of high-stakes talks he said were unfolding behind closed doors, casting the negotiations as a win for the United States, no matter the outcome. Asked directly whether he was pleased with how discussions were going, Trump signaled confidence while keeping details vague, suggesting he was receiving continuous updates as meetings dragged on. He said, "Yeah, I'm getting a lot of reports. They've been meeting for many hours, as you probably have noticed." From there, the president framed the moment in absolute terms, arguing that the United States had already achieved decisive success and that the remaining diplomacy was essentially optional. He portrayed the negotiations as a choice rather than a necessity, repeatedly returning to the idea that Washington held the upper hand, regardless of whether an agreement emerged. He said, asterisk, we'll see what happens. Look, regardless, we win. Regard. Deathless, what happens, we win. Asterisk, Trump's comments landed at the intersection of military claims, energy security, and global shipping areas that have become tightly linked as tensions around Iran have repeatedly raised fears about disruptions in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, a critical corridor for international oil and gas flows. In his telling, the United States was not merely managing the crisis, it had already prevailed. He said, asterisk, we've totally defeated that country, and so let's see what happens. Maybe they make a deal, maybe they don't. Askew, he then narrowed his argument to what he described as America's strategic advantage, suggesting that even if other countries were anxious about the threat of disrupted shipping, the United States could still come out ahead. He emphasized energy exports and painted a vivid picture of tankers moving toward American shores, implying that turmoil elsewhere would only reinforce U.S. leverage as a supplier. He said, asterisks from the stand. D point of America, we win. One of the things that's happening is that boats are sailing up and heading out to our country, big, beautiful tankers, and we're loading them up with oil and gas and everything else. And it's a pretty beautiful thing to see. Asterisks, the president's remarks blended a diplomatic storyline with a battlefield-style narrative, claiming military dominance and control of maritime conditions. He described the situation as involving very deep negotiations with Iran, but repeatedly returned to the claim that the outcome did not matter to him because the United States had already achieved its goals. He said, we're going to see what happens. We're in very deep negotiations with Iran. We win regardless. Then came the most sweeping assertions. Trump claimed the United States had defeated Iran militarily and described alleged Iranian actions involving mines before presenting an account of Iranian naval losses that he characterized as total. He said, asterisk, we've defeated them militarily. They've dropped a couple of water mines. You call them water mines in the boat. Asked in the same breath, he expanded his claims to Iran's naval capabilities, describing what he said had been the destruction of Iranian vessels and specialized mine-laying craft. His language was emphatic and absolute, leaving little room for ambiguity. He said, asterisk, we've defeated all of their water boats, too. Their Navy has gone 158 ships. They have 28 water droppers, mine droppers, they call them. All of them are sunk. Trump continued by suggesting there could still be mines in the water, while saying U.S. forces were actively clearing them. He framed that effort as part of a broader push to secure the strait and keep maritime traffic moving. He said, asterisks, they probably have a couple of mines in the water. We have mine sweepers out there. We're sweeping the strait task. Alongside the military framing, the president again underlined that negotiations might or might not produce a deal and insisted that either way, the United States would proceed to reopen the waterway. He described the Strait of Hormuz as something the United States itself does not rely on, while emphasizing that many other countries do and that Washington would act, in his words, on their behalf as well. He said, asterisk, in addition to that, we're negotiating whether we make a deal or not. It makes no difference to me. Asterisks. He then laid out the next step as he saw it, opening the strait not because the United States needs it, but because other nations do. In that statement, he also introduced a sharp critique of allies, suggesting they were hesitant, unwilling, or incapable of handling the situation without American action. He said, asterisk, and now all we do is we'll open up the strait, even though we don't use it, because we have a lot of other countries in the world that do use it, that are either afraid or weak or cheap. Asterisk, Trump's criticism did not stop there. He said the United States was supported by NATO, a pointed charge that injects alliance politics into what is often framed as a regional security issue with global economic consequences. He said, asterisk, I don't know what it is, but we were not helped by NATO, that I can tell you. Taken together, the comments projected a message of dominance and inevitability, that Iran had been subdued, that the strait would be secured, and that the United States would benefit economically as energy markets and shipping lanes adjusted to the pressure. But the president's remarks also raised immediate questions about specifics, what exactly he meant by defeated, what actions had occurred at sea, and how those claims aligned with the broader public understanding of events in the region. Trump's language also revealed how he wanted the story told, not as a crisis that could spiral, but as a moment that showcased American strength and leverage. He framed the negotiations as lengthy and serious, but he also treated them as something that could be abandoned without cost. That posture, projecting confidence while keeping details sparse, has been a hallmark of his public approach to high-stakes international bargaining. The broader context is that any suggestion of mines in or near the Strait of Hormuz instantly triggers global attention. The strait is narrow and strategically vital, and even the perception of danger can cause shipping delays, higher insurance costs, and spikes in energy prices. For Gulf states and major importers in Asia and Europe, the free flow of tankers is not an abstract principle. It is an economic lifeline. Trump's remarks about tankers heading out to our country and being loaded up with oil and gas also tie into a larger shift in energy markets. The United States has become a major exporter of oil and liquefied natural gas, and disruptions elsewhere can strengthen American producers' position. In the president's framing, that dynamic becomes part of the strategic calculus. If other row tests become uncertain, U.S. supply becomes more attractive. At the same time, his comments about allies being afraid or weak or cheap signaled frustration, with burden sharing a recurring theme in his approach to alliances. By bringing NATO into the conversation, he suggested that even when the issue is centered in the Middle East, he expects allied participation, or at least allied support, in operations that safeguard global commerce. But perhaps the most striking element of Trump's remarks was the insistence that the United States had already totally defeated Iran and that Iran's navy had been effectively wiped out. Those claims, delivered in sweeping terms, were presented as settled facts rather than contested assertions. He did not provide operational details, and he did not describe the timeline or the circumstances under which such a broad outcome would have occurred. Still, his message to both domestic and international audiences was clear. The United States would keep the strait open, the negotiations would continue for now, and the president believed the balance of power was firmly on Washington's side. Near the end of the exchange, Trump pivoted to China, another key player in the global energy market and a major importer of Gulf oil. He delivered a warning that suggested Beijing's actions could carry consequences, though he did not elaborate on what specific move he was responding to. He said, asterisks, well, if China does that, China's going to have big problems, okay? The idea that beyond Iran and the immediate maritime security issue, there could be a larger geopolitical contest shaping how countries respond, who escorts ships, who applies pressure, who benefits from rerouted energy flows, and who pays the price if tensions escalate. And that is where the moment now stands. The president portraying negotiations as active and ongoing, insisting the United States has already achieved military victory, promising the strait will be opened, criticizing allies for not helping, and warning China against whatever step he believes could complicate the situation further. In the next phase, attention turns to what can be confirmed about the situation at sea, what the negotiations are actually aiming to produce, how other governments are responding to the president's claims, and what all of this could mean for shipping energy prices and the risk of a wider confrontation. The president's comments quickly moved from optimism about the talks to a sweeping claim of strategic inevitability, the idea that Washington cannot lose even if diplomacy collapses. That framing matters because negotiations with Iran have rarely been insulated from events at sea, energy markets, or the risk of miscalculation in the narrow waterways that connect the Persian Gulf to the wider world. At the center of his argument was a blunt assertion that the balance of power has already been settled. He said, we've totally defeated that country, and so let's see what happens. Maybe they make a deal, maybe they don't. It's a line designed to do two things at once: project strength outward toward Tehran, while also signaling to domestic audiences that any agreement would be a bonus rather than a concession. The subtext is that the United States is negotiating from a position of dominance and therefore has the luxury of patience. But in the real world, negotiations don't happen in a vacuum. They happen alongside shipping insurance spikes, tanker rerouting, nervous energy traders, and the constant risk of an incident at sea that forces leaders to react before diplomats can. The president leaned into that maritime dimension, describing what he portrayed as a clear-cut military outcome and a manageable cleanup operation. He said, we're in very deep negotiations with Iran. We win regardless. We've defeated them militarily. Then he added a set of claims about attacks and naval losses that, if taken literally, would represent an extraordinary escalation. He said they've dropped a couple of water mines, you call them water mines, in the boat, He continued, we've defeated all of their water boats too. And he went further still, asserting asterisks, their Navy has gone 158 ships. They have 28 water droppers, mine droppers, they call them. All of them are sunk. Aspects, those lines, delivered in the same breath as talk of diplomacy, illustrate the dual-track message he was trying to send. Talks are underway, but the military contest is already over. The difficulty is that these are not the kinds of statements that remain confined to a press scrum. They reverberate in capitals across the region, in the offices of shipping companies, and among allies who may be asked to support a security effort or to absorb the consequences if tensions rise. The president also tried to minimize the economic risk to the United States by shifting attention to American energy strength. He described a scene of tankers arriving and being filled, portraying the U.S. as insulated from disruptions that might spook other import-dependent nations. He said, asterisks, from the standpoint of America, we win. Asterisks, one of the things that's happening is that boats are sailing up and heading out to our country, big, beautiful tankers, and we're loading them up with oil and gas and everything else. And it's a pretty beautiful thing to see. Asking, this is a familiar strategic narrative. America as a major producer and exporter, less vulnerable than it once was to Middle East shocks, positioned to supply allies and profit from demand.